Hello everyone, and welcome to the start of the fourth and final unit of the semester, and technically of the entire year of anatomy and physiology. So congrats on making it this far. Hopefully you realize your knowledge has expanded quite greatly, and I often think it's hard for students to realize how much knowledge they acquired because, of course, you're learning it little by little, take an exam, and then continue moving forward. But I think this last unit does a pretty nice job, especially when we get to the last chapter, which is chapter 27, which is going to be fluid balance and electrolyte balance. I think you should start seeing how much you've really acquired, and I hope a lot of you feel like you've learned and walked away with a lot this semester. Certainly a tough topic when it comes to anatomy and physiology, but I think, it's amazing when we realize what the body is capable of doing, how it's adapted and evolved into what it currently is. All right, so as you can see, the first lecture here for chapter 26 is broken up into two parts. Overall, it's an intro to the urinary system, but here in part one, we're going to talk about the urinary organs and then get into some of the basic kidney anatomy. These are the main structures you need to know. This first lecture is super important to get down. We're going to build off of this. It's definitely one of the key lectures to note. And then from there, we're going to continue on into the nephron and talk about its anatomy and start talking a little bit about exchange and how that structure helps with the exchange. And then by the time we get to lecture 2, that's really when we get into the exchange process and the lecture gets kind of intense. So need to work through this first stuff. It has a lot of great testing material related to the lab exam and just anatomical descriptions. So let's look at our objectives here. So if we look at our objectives for the first one, you can see it's mostly just anatomy, describing the main big picture. And then here we get into the anatomy of the nephron, talk about types of nephrons, and start getting into the processes. Because when we move into the second lecture, that's really where we're going to see kind of the complexity of the urinary system and get into the functionality of that nephron. As usual, we start off with every first part of each lecture, we bring up the citation. So we are following along still with Pearson's Fundamentals of Anatomy and Physiology. In this case, we are moving along with chapter 26 here, making use of those the images from chapter 26 and just following right along with it. Let's get into the chapter here. All right, so an introduction here. So we're going to begin with just describing the main functions of the urinary system. I always encourage you to think about the functions, and usually most students can come up with one or two, and then the other ones are kind of obvious as you describe them, but you really wouldn't think, hey, that's a function of that system. So on a lecture exam, definitely expect which of the following is a function of the urinary system or which of the following is not. You've seen quite a bit of those questions as we've moved along here. But overall, the urinary system, its function is to remove physiological waste. And when we talk about these physiological wastes, we have to consider what waste are we talking about. So what's the waste that we're talking about? And if you're just looking at the figure, you might have been able to come up with the best answer of the main waste, which if you look at the percentages, hands down, urea is going to be the main one. And that's the waste product of amino acids, something that we talked about through digestion and more specifically metabolism when we were talking about deamination, right? We talked about deamination producing ammonia, and that ammonia has to be detoxed at the liver to produce urea. So you definitely should know that urea is a combination of ammonia and CO2. Definitely know that main waste. All right, but when we look at the urinary system and talk about their general functions, there's really 3 to think about. We have excretion, excreting substances into the urine, and when we get to we'll definitely describe this when we get to the nephron. But excretion is the actual removal of products from the cells. In this case, essentially, when it comes to the urinary system, excretion is removing the waste and dissolving it into the urine itself, and then we'll, of course, urinate that out. Elimination is the urination process, so that's the discharge of waste. So not only do we have to create the waste and excrete them into a fluid, then we have to eliminate that fluid, and that's, of course, of urine. And so where are we getting rid of it? We're getting rid of it and discharging it to the environment. And then we have the homeostatic functions, and this is the tough one. So this is really where we get into the big part of this urinary system. So hands down, these two I think are kind of obvious. Create the waste and then get rid of the waste. But here we have a lot of regulation, and if you think about it, we've talked a lot about like erythropoietin production. We've talked about calcitriol. So you already know that there's some things going on. We know ADH and aldosterone target the kidneys. So obviously when it comes down to those targets, we're talking the homeostatic regulation of volume and solute concentrations of the blood. That one should be fairly straightforward as we progress in the chapter. So I think these functions become more and more obvious, especially the homeostatic regulation, as we advance in the chapter and kind of close it out. All right, but the main waste you should definitely know is when we talk about urine as being what we're getting rid of, you should know the main waste hands down is urea. Okay, and that's the main waste product. But you can see urine, it's the complete cell waste products that get dissolved in water. So that's what urine is, all the waste products. And you can see there's sodium, there's some calcium, there's chloride, there's some ammonia, but ultimately urea is the main one that we want to get in there. Okay, so keep that in mind. Urea, definitely no main waste product. Also note, most urine has a pH usually in approximately around 6, so it's slightly acidic, but it can range between 4.5 to 8. But often, if you remember when we go back and talk about aldosterone, if you remember, it was sodium reabsorption and potassium exchange, but often there's also a hydrogen release as well. That we'll talk about a little bit later, which is going to regulate some of this pH. All right, so what are the 4 organs of the urinary system? So US stands for urinary system, and what are their functions? So if you go to figure 26.1, you'll have the figure that really talks about all these. But hands down, in our lab, I have a model that looks exactly the same as this, so I would expect students to be able to recognize it. The difference is the model I have in the classroom actually has seminal vesicles, so it would be a male version of this, which is often what I ask, and I explain to my students. Clearly here, this is a female's version. You can tell by the urethra there. You can also tell by the mammary glands. But anyway, so you need to know the urinary system consists of the kidneys, and the kidneys are going to be the site of urine production. So they're the organs where nephrons are located, and those nephrons produce the urine. So big picture-wise or macroscopic-wise, we know the kidney produces urine. Then we can look down here. We have the tubes that connect the kidney to of course, the bladder down here, which are called ureters. And so ureters, those transport the produced urine to the bladder. That's what you should note. If you've ever get a kidney stone, the kidney stones where you really feel the pain is as it goes through the ureter, and it can take multiple really long time, 12 to 24 hours, and during that time it is quite painful. I've experienced one. Not that fun, but once it reaches the bladder, the hard part's over. But no, the ureters transport urine, and you're going to find out the ureter and the urinary bladder, those are going to be transitional epithelium. And so when it comes to the bladder, you should know it's temporary storage of urine. Most people's bladders on average can hold about 2 liters of urine. All right. For me, I don't like holding urine in, so I'm always going to the bathroom. But if you're somebody that can hold it long, you can hold up to about 2 liters before you really have to purge that. And then finally, our last organ, of course, is the urethra right there, and that's going to transport urine to the environment. For males, what else does the urethra transport? So keep that in mind. So here where I have also, that's specific for males. Don't forget the urethra will also transport the semen that males produce. So for the urethra for females, it's straightforward. It's just straight urine. For males, you need to consider it's urine as well as semen. All right, so other homeostatic functions. So by regulating water and solute loss, this is going to contribute to a large amount of other things. And so this is the homeostatic function. So obviously, water and solute loss contributes to also blood volume and blood pressure. So adjusting water loss in urine, and that's done by releasing erythropoietin, releasing renin. We know that there's ADH, aldosterone, natriuretic peptides. We've talked about all those, and hands down at this point, we're still building off of it. So a lot of the concepts from the first unit are still here. ADH, aldosterone was brought up in the first chapter that we talked about, and it's continuing to follow us here. All right, there's also the regulation of plasma concentrations, whether it's sodium, whether it's potassium, whether it's chloride. There's also other items. We've seen calcium regulation via calcitriol. We've seen aldosterone regulate sodium and potassium levels, right? So that's what we're talking about here, that any of the hormones that targeted the kidneys, we're really dealing with that sort of regulation. there's going to be the stabilization of blood pH. And the way this happens is controlling the loss of hydrogen ions or controlling the loss of bicarbonate. If we need to increase our pH, i.e. if we need to get rid of the acidity, we can do so by releasing hydrogen ions into the urine. And so our urine would become more acidic, and that would level out our body to become more basic. Or if our body is basic and we need to increase the acidity, we would get rid of the bicarbonate ions. These are what buffer the hydrogen. So by getting rid of the buffer, now hydrogen ions are starting to build, so the pH would go down when we get rid of bicarbonate. And we'll continue to talk about that. If you wanted to write those notes, I would recommend it. If you didn't write it and you're like, I'm kind of overwhelmed with the content right now, then don't worry about writing it. We're going to come back to all those concepts later. All right, but the kidney also functions to conserve valuable nutrients. All right, it regulates what things are kept and which are lost, and that's going to be based on whether we have an excessive amount of substances or not. So, excessive sugars, we're usually going to absorb them using insulin, but amino acids, if we don't build proteins, our body's going to want to get rid of them. If we have an excessive amount of calcium that we just ingested, our kidneys are going to want to get rid of them. I.e., our kidneys are working closely with the liver, as we've seen, to really adjust the right concentrations. In fact, it's worked so close with the liver, notice, assist the liver in the detox of poisons and the deamination of amino acids. So the liver does kind of the hard work of getting rid of the toxins, or at least breaking down the toxins into less toxic substance, and then the kidneys' goal is to get rid of those wastes. And so that's really what we're seeing here with these functions. Again, it's hard for me to directly test on these, but we're going to continue to build off this. So right now, this is the big picture. These are the things you should keep in mind that can happen. But like I said, I can expand on this and talk about, hey, if the pH of the body is too low, what can the kidneys do to stabilize blood pH? Well, they would release the hydrogen ion. So we're going to build off these concepts as we move ahead here. All right, so the next part is talking about kidney location. So we're really continuing the anatomical descriptions here. So if you notice, the left kidney sits a little bit higher than the right. All right, right kidney slightly inferior due to the liver. And we saw this already. The liver definitely displaces things. It displaced the lung, and now you can see the liver is displacing the kidney, forcing it to be a little bit inferior to the left kidney, or you can say the left kidney is slightly superior in comparison to the left kidney. It really doesn't make a difference, but you should know that minor detail there. All right, what organ sits superior to the kidney? You should know, of course, what we're talking about is the adrenal gland. So all this is fair game for me to label like adrenal gland, kidney, ureters. If I was viewing it, still would expect you to know these are the common iliac arteries and veins. Those sort of things are still fair game. Now, as we move on to the kidney location, you should definitely note that we're going to talk about what stabilizes the kidney in place. So first and foremost, you should know there's connective tissue that stabilizes kidney. The outermost connective tissue of the organ is called the fibrous capsule. Okay, so know the kidney is a capsulated organ, and the outer region is the fibrous capsule. All right, it's just basically collagen fibers on the outer surface of the organ, surrounding it and encapsulating it. Then what we have is we have something called perinephric fat. So if you're looking down here, they show you the capsule, and the capsule is literally the outer region. Perinephric fat is going to be superficial to this. So perinephric fat is going to be adipose that surrounds the fibrous capsule, so it is superficial. And as we know, it functions in insulation just like all fat does. All right, so this is a supportive insulatory material. That's usually how it's asked it. What sits superficial to the capsule, and it consists of adipose tissue that protects the kidney. You should know perinephric fat. The final one is what holds or anchors the kidney in the body wall. Hands down, you should know renal fascia. This one I like to test on because it's really easy to describe. Similarly, same with fibrous capsule. Perinephric fat, it's a little bit hard for me to describe because usually I have to use the term adipose tissue, which I don't like doing. So definitely focus a lot of your attention on renal fascia and fibrous capsule, but it's not hard for me to list the following structures in order. And so perinephric fat surrounds the fibrous capsule, and then the renal fascia is what's going to anchor it. All right, renal fascia will fuse with deep fascia of the muscle in the body wall. So essentially what you have is a capsule that gets surrounded by fat, and that capsule is also suspended by connective tissue. So I probably wouldn't list the layers in order because technically the renal fascia is definitely going to attach. So I scratch what I said about linking those tissues. It would be impossible to list them in order because the renal fascia is actually going to anchor the kidney, which means it's binding to the capsule, not perinephric fat. So just have an understanding of what these are. really where the big bulk of the lecture and the main point and the main anatomy comes from is right here. Breaking these structures down, hands down, is important. This is the most important structure to spend time with, really learn these structures, because that's what I'm going to test on pretty heavily. And so you need to know this outer region here. Well, first and foremost, the outermost region you should know is the capsule. So this brownish color, they even labeled as fibrous capsule. So what you see in brown is the actual fibrous capsule. But what's deep to that capsule begins with the renal cortex. So out in this region, you should know is the renal cortex. That's a region. So notice outermost region in contact with the capsule. So if usually on a lab exam, I would just highlight this region and say, what is the specific region? I would put a sticker here and say, what's the region being identified by sticker 10, for instance. In that case, renal cortex would be the answer. And yes, you should get in the habit of putting renal cortex. Cortex should not be your answer. Write out the full things that they write out. All right, don't try to take the shorthand or the shortcut for this. All right, the renal medulla, again, it's a region. All right, the renal medulla is a region that consists of 6 to 18 distinct renal pyramids. Here we can see this one only has 7. But I would highlight this region here and ask, what is the region? If I say region, and as you know on my lab exams, context clues are a must. So if I say region, it has to be the medulla, because a medulla is a region. Now, I can actually put a sticker on these areas and say, what are the structures here? All right, what are these triangular-like structures? You should know that's the renal pyramid. In that case, I will use the term structure. Structure and region are not the same, and that's really important to walk away with. Very key skills when it comes to anatomical descriptions, which I've stressed the entire semester, and I am very strict on those. All right, but if you notice, there's space between the pyramids, and so you should note that those are called the renal columns, and really that's just an extension of the cortex tissue. So here's the cortical tissue right here. It's just extending and separating the two pyramids. Notice, renal columns is not hard for me to describe. Now, if you take a pyramid, the overarching renal cortex, and so they actually dotted line this region here. You can see this whole thing right there. And then their renal columns with it, that's a kidney lobe. And that's really where we say the site of urine production occurs. Usually what I ask for on the exam is, which of the following structures produces urine? Usually it's the nephron. The kidney would be an answer. It's pretty rare that I say kidney lobe, but understand the kidney lobe is the functional unit of the kidney. It's the macroscopic functional unit of the kidney. I say that because the functional unit of the kidney is going to be the nephron, but the large functional unit, i.e. the macroscopic view, we tend to say it's the kidney lobe. All right, and then if you go down, you should see there's tipped regions of these pyramids. Those tipped regions, those are known as the renal papilla, which I definitely expect students to know. In fact, you can see the renal papilla there. In fact, our models that I have in the classroom actually change the tip color a little bit, and so often it's really easy for me to label renal papilla. Now, if you notice, the papilla end up going into this tube-like network here. So the first part of the tube, where the renal papilla ends, you should know is the minor calyx. So once urine formation occurs, it's passing through small tubes in here. Those small tubes drain at the renal papilla and drain into the minor calyx. So urine starts forming in the minor calyx to get sent to the urine. That minor calyx, notice there's a minor here, there's a minor here, there's a minor here. But when we open up where several minors come together, that forms a major calyces. In fact, this is another minor calyx that would be draining into this area. So this whole area is a major. This whole area is a major because we got 1, 2, so that's a major calyx here. 1, 2, that's a major calyx. Now notice, as those major calyces all come together, they form the renal pelvis. Yes, I expect you not only to know the order of urine flow through the kidney, I definitely expect you to know minor calyx to major calyx to renal pelvis, and that renal pelvis will eventually become the ureter. Now, the model I have in classroom is very similar to this. I never label the ureter on this. I'm always labeling the renal pelvis. But basically, if you want to know whether it's the renal pelvis or the ureter, if it's near up in this region, it's definitely the renal pelvis. As soon as we start actually descending, so becoming running vertically, then I would say that's when it goes from renal pelvis to ureter. So down here would hands down be the ureter, but I don't ever test students on that. Those of you taking another instructor, you might want to ask them, hey, how would you label ureter versus renal pelvis? Because that's often a commonly missed question on my lab exams, or students often write down the wrong answer there. All right, but overall, that really summarizes the structures here. So notice we had cortex, we had the renal columns, we had the renal medulla. These structures are the pyramids, which is going to be the location of most of the tubular network of the nephron, as we're going to see. And then we got that draining at the renal papilla. That drains into the minor calyx, which becomes a major calyx, which becomes the renal pelvis, eventually becoming the ureter. Notice they do have the word hilum on here. So the hilum is the entrance and exit site. So blood vessels would also be entering here that we don't see, but that's going to be the major site. Okay, but hands down, learn this anatomy. This is not that intense of anatomy. It's less intense than the heart, and you need to do well on this lab portion. That's really where students are able to gain good points and easy points. So study this, learn this anatomy, and then again, big picture wise, you should be learning these structures. Like I said, the esophageal hiatus is right there, but you should know adrenal gland, kidney, here's the renal vein, here's a renal artery in red, ureters, this is the left common, or sorry, in this case, this is the right common iliac artery, this is the internal iliac, this would be the external. Those things are expected for you to still know. All right, but overall, it's a really nice introduction to the big picture stuff on the urinary system. So hands down, have to really learn these structures and the anatomy of the urinary system to do well moving forward. So far on the group note review, we've really gotten through these first 3 questions. As you can see, we're going to continue on and get into the nephron in the next part of this lecture. So lecture 1 is 2 parts. We will get into the second part on the next lecture. So look out for part 2 of lecture 1 coming up shortly. I hope to see you all there. As usual, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask, and I will see you as we move on to part 2. Take care and have a great rest of the day, everyone.